Proposition 34 asks voters to replace the death penalty for convicted murderers in the state of California with a sentence of life in prison with no parole. Supporters claim the death penalty is costly and ineffective. Opponents argue it gives justice to victims' families and keeps communities safer. Here live in studio, we have James Clark from the Yes on 34 and a supporter of the measure, and Phyllis Loya, a crime victims advocate and mother of a slain police officer from the No on Prop 34 campaign to debate the pros and cons of Prop 34. Welcome to both of you. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you.
Well, I'm going to start with you, James. Now, the death penalty was reinstated in California in 1978. Why the ban now?
Well, like you said, it was reinstated in 1978. So we've had 34 years to really see how the death penalty works in California. And we've seen that it doesn't work. It's actually broken beyond repair. In those 34 years, California has only executed 13 people, but we've spent $4 billion to maintain that system. We give special privileges to death row inmates. They get special legal teams. They have so many appeals. And in fact, the vast majority of death row inmates die of old age while on death row, and they're not executed at all. So it's time that we replace that system with justice that works for everyone in California. And that's what life in prison with no possibility of parole provides.
Okay. Well, Phyllis, I'm going to have you jump in. Your son was police officer Larry Lassiter, and he was killed chasing down robbery suspects. Why is it so important for you to see that this measure is not passed?
Because I think that my son is entitled to justice, as are all the other innocent victims of death row killers. There are 43 police officers who were killed by death row inmates. There are 225 child victims. 5 victims under the age of 22 months died as a result of being sexually assaulted by their death row killers. I disagree with the Yes on 34 folks in the change to life without possibility of parole. They act as if that's a guarantee. That's absolutely untrue. And one only has to look at recently passed SB 9, which changed the law for juvenile killers who killed when they were 16 and 17 and were sentenced to life without possibility of parole. The SB 9 was just passed into law this past month, signed by Governor Brown, and it now allows those killers to petition to have their sentence modified after only serving 15 years. They're giving multiple opportunities, each one forcing the families of the victims to relive their horrific murders.
So you said this wouldn't be a guarantee. Why don't you think that this would be a guarantee that those folks would receive life in prison without parole? What do you see happening?
Because if the state legislature can change life without possibility of parole
for minors,
they can do it for adults. The whole argument with minors is that their brains weren't fully developed, that they weren't developed until their mid-20s. What's to stop these same proponents from next year introducing legislation that says, well, let's look at defendants who committed crimes under 21 and then under 25. The Yes on 34 folks have an agenda. They want to abolish the death penalty. Then they want to do away with life without possibility of parole. They want to shorten prison sentences.
Well, let me have James jump in here. Is there any truth in that? Is this the slippery slope that you just keep eroding away at these terms?
Absolutely not. Life in prison without the possibility of parole means exactly what it says. We've actually had life without parole for 34 years in California, and that's a justice system that we've seen works. We've seen that nobody who has been justly sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole has ever been released from a California prison. So we know that if we replace the death penalty with life in prison with no chance of parole, then all of those killers will remain behind bars for the rest of their lives, unless one of them can prove that they might be innocent. And that's the real key to life in prison without the possibility of parole, because if someone is innocent, then they need to be alive to prove it.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, the Innocence Projects and other organizations have freed hundreds of wrongly convicted people across the nation. Now, in California, none of them have been on death row that they've overturned.
3 people on California's death row have been shown to be innocent and exonerated from death row.
And removed from the death row list.
Yes, exactly.
So what do you say about that? I mean, how would you feel if you knew that there were innocent people being put to death? I mean, there have been folks who, given the time to be able to prove their case, have been exonerated. I mean, isn't there some?
I think we have one of the best legal systems in the world. I think that these defendants are giving so much help in presenting their case. I think there's absolutely no danger of that happening in California. Even anti-death penalty Governor Jerry Brown says that there's no proof that any innocent person has ever been executed in California. His father, after the death penalty was abolished, his father released 3 people who had been on death row. They went out and killed again. And in recent exonerations, there's a gentleman by the name of Joseph Brown who was on death row in Florida, and he's been touring the country for the last several years talking about how he was exonerated after being 17 hours shy of being executed. That same Joseph Brown is under arrest and incarcerated now in North Carolina for killing his wife on September 13th.
Okay. Well, let's just talk a little bit about who these folks are. I mean, the death penalty, and there are some skewed racial statistics of who's on death row. And does the death penalty really get at the heart of these crimes? 70% of Hispanic and African Americans are victims, but a majority of death penalty cases are for white victims. I mean, is there a disparity here that you see?
I think that the statistics you're looking at are flawed, and I think if you actually went on to the Department of Corrections website, they have a breakdown and you can see what they are.
One thing that you mentioned there was the race of the victim and how that plays into the death penalty. And I think one side of the question of crime and punishment and justice that we haven't talked about is unsolved crime. And in fact, in California, 56% of reported rapes go unsolved every year, and 46% of homicides go unsolved. And those numbers go up even higher when we're talking about crimes committed against victims of color and in communities with minority residents. So Prop 34 actually directs funds to work on that issue of unsolved crime and provide money for local law enforcement to do things like DNA test for rape kits and more fingerprint analysis and bring killers to justice to keep our communities safe.
Could I respond to that?
Sure.
That $100 million to law enforcement, if that was such a boon to law enforcement, why is every major law enforcement agency in California against Proposition 34? That $100 million would be taken from the general fund, could certainly be used for other great needs in California. It would be given over 4 years. It's not certain whether it's new money or redirected money. And it only amounts, if you took that money and divided it among all the law enforcement agencies in California, it would amount to having a detective for about 11 years. Our justice system is not for sale in California. Although millions of dollars are being funneled into the campaign for Yes on 34 from out-of-state donors, our justice system is not for sale to the highest bidder.
Now, but some of those forces, I mean, wouldn't they want to see, more unsolved cases? I mean, even some hours of law enforcement work towards those unsolved crimes, isn't that something?
I'm sure that many of them would apply for grants for that, but they're not supporting this proposition because they see this as a deceptive way of trying to persuade the voters to pass it.
And what do you say to that, James?
Well, I think we should look at all of the savings that we can get by voting yes on Prop 34. So Prop 34 actually saves $130 million every single year. That's as determined by the Legislative Analyst's Office, the nonpartisan office in the state that determines the fiscal impact of the initiatives. Now, many people find this really surprising or confusing because they think that the death penalty should save money, but in reality it costs even more than life in prison without the possibility of parole because of extra costs from trials to more investigators, more lawyers, longer appeals.
But then does that take into account things like, added costs of health care and basically housing these folks long term? Actually,
it does. There was recently a study, it was done by a federal judge named Arthur Alarcon. He himself is pro-death penalty. And he conducted a study to look at exactly how much California has spent on the death penalty. And he found that it's been $4 billion over the last 30 years. And that includes the housing costs of life in prison without the possibility of parole and the health care costs. Because, you know, one of the reasons that is that so many death row inmates die of old age and not execution. So we're paying healthcare costs for elderly inmates, whether they're on death row or life in prison without the possibility of parole.
You know what's infuriating to me as a victim? To hear the people that created most of the costs, that created most of the delay, now saying, it costs too much, let's get rid of it. It's like someone killing their parents and saying, have pity on me, I'm an orphan. No, that's not fair.
What do you say to that, James? You know, a lot of people are saying, why are people on death row for so long? I mean, why, you know, if you make a decision, let's move on with it. Why not carry it out?
Well, first of all, those protections are put in place by the courts, by the United States Supreme Court and the California Supreme Court, and they're there to make sure we never execute an innocent person. That's why the death penalty takes so much longer than any other penalty in the California justice system. And no matter how many protections we put in place to try to make sure that we can never make a mistake, the reality is our justice system is human, and it's never going to be perfect. There's always that risk of making mistakes.
But what do you say to families like Phyllis's who, you know, they want the murder of their loved one to be put to that death so they may have some closure?
I can completely understand that desire, and the reality is we've seen in California, we just can't do it. Our system is too broken, and it cannot be repaired. That's why out of about 900 death sentences in the last 30 years, only 13 have been executed. But all those other victims' family members, they're dragged through decades and decades and decades of appeals. They have to live through that uncertainty of knowing whether or not knowing whether or not the person will be executed. So that's why life in prison without the possibility of parole at least allows victims' families to move on with their lives, not spend their time in court and in appeals.
And what do you say to that, Phyllis?
I say that the death penalty isn't about closure. It's about justice. I want justice for my son. I want justice for the other victims. And if I could go back to the cost argument that he made, only 1% of the budget for the department, for the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation is spent on death row prisoners. Only 1%. There are only 2% of deaths of murderers incarcerated in California are death row inmates, which means 98% of the murderers don't get the death sentence. It's given for the worst of the worst offenses.
And so why wouldn't life without parole give a sense of justice?
Because I know that life without possibility of parole can be changed just like it was changed this year.
And what if that was, I mean, you know, obviously you have your opinion on that, but what if that wasn't the case? What if there was a guarantee that life without parole meant just that? Would that serve justice?
I believe that the death penalty is the appropriate sentence for the worst of the worst. You know, my son served his country as a Marine captain. He lost his life serving his community. When he died, he was an organ donor. He saved 5 lives. What more could my son have possibly given the citizens of the state of California? Therefore, I have no hesitation in asking the same citizens that he protected and served to vote no on 34.
You know, she mentioned that only 2% of killers in California are actually on death row. I think that's very important. That 2% are the number of people that we're spending so much money on, $4 billion on just 2% of the killers. But I actually want to take a moment and talk about the differences between death row and life without parole.
Okay, I'm not sure how much time we have for that. If you could do it in about 30 seconds.
Sure. I think the biggest difference is that inmates on death row don't work and they have a private cell to themselves. But on that's on death row. And life without parole, they work, they pay restitution, and they share their cell.
But are those people you want working?
When they're able to work, when they can safely work under correct conditions,
well,
yes.
I am going to have to close it out here. I appreciate both of you coming in. We're just simply out of time. Thanks for James Clark and Phyllis Loya.